Hello, welcome to Lesson 12 of Topic B6, Inheritance, Variation and Evolution. The title of this lesson is Theories of Evolution and it is for our triple biology students only. So if you're studying the combined science pathway, you can move on to Lesson 13. My name's Mrs. Keenan and I'm going to talk you through this lesson. Our outcomes for today, our challenge outcome, we are going to describe Darwin and Lamarck's theories of evolution, and then we are going to compare the similarities and the differences between the two theories. So I want you to think for a second to start us off. There are three main reasons why Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was not accepted. What were these reasons? And I'm going to give you 1 minute just to jot your ideas down. Okay, so what did you come up with? The main reasons that Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was not accepted are: the theory challenged the idea that God made all animals and plants that live on Earth. There was insufficient evidence at the time the theory was published to convince many of the world's scientists. And the mechanism of inheritance and variation was not known until 50 years after the theory was published. So the actual movement of characteristics via genes and via cell division, the knowledge of that process didn't catch up till 50 years later. So the theory challenged God's idea that all things were created by God, insufficient evidence at the time, and the mechanism of inheritance wasn't understood. Just a reminder then, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection said that individual organisms within a species show a wide range of variations for any particular characteristic. Reproduction then occurs between individuals within a species, and it's only the individuals that have the characteristics that make them most likely to survive in the conditions they need to live in, that survive and successfully reproduce. So what happens is the organisms then that have these desirable characteristics and reproduce will pass on the genes for these desirable characteristics to their offspring, and over generations the species will evolve due to natural selection. Another term which is used instead of natural selection is survival of the fittest, and that just means that the individuals which have the characteristics which makes them the fittest or the most able to survive in the environment or the conditions they live in will be more likely to survive and therefore reproduce and pass on the genes for those characteristics. So just a quick recap there of natural selection if you've forgotten from the previous lesson. So these two people, a couple of lessons ago, we looked at the picture on the left and you were asked to identify the man, and it is Charles Darwin. Now we're going to introduce the chap on the right, who is Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French biologist, and he thought that all organisms were linked by what he called a fountain of life. He made the great step forward of suggesting that individual animals adapted and evolved to suit the environment they lived in. His idea was that every type of animal originally evolved from primitive worms. The change from worms to other organisms was caused by the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, Lamarck's theory proposed that the way organisms behaved affected the features of their body. A case of if you use it, you'll keep it, but if you don't use it, you'll lose it. So if animals used a particular feature a lot over a lifetime, Lamarck proposed that this feature would then grow and develop. Any useful changes that took place in the organism during its lifetime would then be passed from the parent onto the offspring. So in the example of the giraffe and the neck length, Lamarck thought if they didn't use their long necks to reach the tallest branches of the trees, the neck would shrink and be lost. Lamarck's theory influenced the way Charles Darwin thought. However, there were many problems with his theory. There was no evidence for his fountain of life, and people didn't like the idea they descended from worms. People could also quite clearly see that changes in their bodies, such as large muscles, were not then passed on to future generations. And we now know that in the great majority of cases, Lamarck's idea of inheritance just cannot happen. But his ideas did pave the way for scientists such as Darwin, gave them something to think about, and Darwin's theory of evolution was thought to build on some of the suggestions that Lamarck made. Okay, so I've just talked to you about these two scientists, Charles Darwin and Lamarck, and they had very different ideas about the theory of evolution. So I'm going to give you a quote from each of them. I'm going to ask you to read through this quote, and then I'm going to ask you to simplify it into your own words, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do so, starting now. Okay, just less than a minute remaining. Read through them again if you're struggling and see how you can put them in simpler terms. Okay, time's up. It's quite a difficult task, isn't it? Let's see what I managed to come up with, and you can compare it to your answers. Okay, how did you get on? It's quite difficult, isn't it? So, the simplified statements that I come up with were: the more you use something, the bigger, faster, stronger, etc. it becomes, and this is passed on to the offspring. So that was for Lamarck. And then for Darwin, there is variation in every species. The best able to survive will do so. They will pass these favourable characteristics on to their offspring. If you want to pause the video now and make a note of those simplified statements, feel free to do so. Okay, so Darwin and Lamarck's ideas challenged each other, but they did have similarities as well as differences. So Darwin would say that the giraffes with the long necks survived because they didn't go hungry. So they then reproduced and passed on the characteristics of having long necks to their offspring, and over generations, the offspring evolved to have longer necks. Whereas Lamarck would say that because the giraffes are using their neck muscles to reach up for the trees, the offspring would be born with stronger, longer neck muscles because they've used it regularly as a habit. Okay, let's try the next one. So antelopes are eaten by lions. Lions are very fast and chase the antelopes. Why can antelopes run fast, according to Darwin? And why can antelopes run fast, according to Lamarck? 1 minute. Okay, so Darwin would say because the antelopes that can run fast survive, they go on to reproduce, so the characteristic of being able to run fast will be passed on to the offspring, and over generations, the offspring will evolve to be able to run faster. Lamarck would say because the antelopes are using their limbs and their muscles in their legs regularly to run fast, These characteristics will be passed on to their offspring because they are regularly used, so they are needed, and that information will be passed on. Okay, did any issues arise with either Darwin or Lamarck's theories for the examples given? 1 minute. Okay, what did you come up with? So we were looking for any issues that might have arisen from either Darwin or Lamarck's theories. Now, with Lamarck's theories, it's the idea that changes occur in an organism due to how much they use particular characteristics. However, we now know that in the majority of cases, that isn't what happens in inheritance. Because you can't pass on characteristics simply because you use something more. A good way of remembering this is if a person decided to go to the gym every day and become a bodybuilder, they are choosing to build up muscle mass in their bodies. But it doesn't mean that their offspring are going to be born more muscular than if they didn't go to the gym. So this idea that you use something more doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be inherited. So now the theory of natural selection by Darwin is the most widely accepted theory for evolution. Because Lamarck said, the more you use something, the bigger, faster and stronger it becomes, and this is passed on to the offspring. So the first part of his theory is correct. It would become bigger or faster or stronger in the examples on muscles if you use them more. But it's the second part that's incorrect because it wouldn't be passed on to its offspring. So the couple in the picture have built up their muscles by working out at the gym, but this characteristic would not then get passed on to their children. So these questions about Darwin and Lamarck and their opposing theories of evolution come up a lot on exams. So this exam question looks at two species of elephants. You don't have to know anything about them. The information is given in the question. But I'm just going to get you to have a look at the question. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to see what you can come up with as your answers. There's 4 marks. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes just to jot your ideas down. So it's asking you to think about the theory of natural selection to explain how the elephant's trunk has evolved. Another 30 seconds. Okay, brilliant. So the first thing you should have written about was something to do with the fact that there is variation in a population. So even within the same species, there will be variations. Any elephants which have a longer nose or a longer trunk would be able to get more food because they'd be able to reach up high into the trees to get the leaves. So these individuals would be more likely to survive. They've got an advantage. They can get more food, so they are more likely to survive. If they're more likely to survive, they're going to be more likely to breed. And the genes or alleles for having a long nose or a long trunk would be passed on to future generations. So the 4 marks are for saying there's variations within the population. Any elephants with a longer trunk or a longer nose will get more food or more leaves. So they will survive and breed, and they will pass on the genes and alleles for having a longer trunk or a longer nose. So it's just the theory of natural selection applied to the example of the elephant. Okay, so Lamarck's theory is different than Darwin's theory. Use Lamarck's theory to explain how the elephant's trunk evolved. And I'm just going to give you 2 minutes again. One minute remaining. Okay, what have you come up with? So if you use Lamarck's theory to explain how the elephant's trunk evolved, you might have said the ancestor, which in the example was Phimona, which is the ancestor would have done, stretched its nose to reach for food or leaves. So it would pass on the stretched nose to the offspring. So for Lamarck's theory questions, it's really simple. What's it doing, or what's it using more, and why? And then just finish off by saying So this would be passed on to the offspring. Because remember, it's just this idea, if you use something more, you're going to enhance that characteristic and it's going to be passed on to offspring. The following notes summarise this lesson. You might want to pause the video here and make a note of some of the ideas. The keywords at the top that are in bold allow you to have a really nice summary of natural selection. Remember to include the starting point of individuals have variations. Then talk about why certain individuals are most suited to the environment, applying it to your example, such as giraffes with longer necks, elephants with longer trunks, antelopes that can run faster. These individuals will survive and reproduce. So the genes for these characteristics are passed on to future generations and evolution occurs. Other key points from this slide: you need to know why Darwin's work was only gradually accepted, and you need to have an understanding of Lamarck's theory of evolution, even though now we've discarded it and we believe that evolution was due to natural selection in line with Darwin's ideas. So pause the video here, make a note of anything you need to.